Welcome to Real World, Real Talk with Dr. D.Z. Cofield. This show represents captivating conversations and insightful information to encourage and inspire you with all you need to become the best you can possibly be. And now, your host for Real World, Real Talk, Dr. D.Z. Cofield.
Welcome to Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. D.Z. Cofield. You're listening to your member-supported public radio station, your number one source for jazz and more, KTSU 90.9 on the FM dial and KTSUradio.com. Now, listen, I have a power-packed show on tonight as we talk about what's going on in our country and specifically what's going on in the state of Texas. So many of us don't understand the importance of voting in representation on the state level. You get the glamour of the U.S. Congress and the U.S. Senate, but we really don't understand the importance of the Texas Legislative House and the Senate and the role that they play in enacting laws that affect us every day. And we're seeing some crazy legislation, and I'm using the word crazy. I'm not going to let my guests use the word, but I'm going to use the word crazy legislation in what is being proposed, what is being passed, and what potentially will be signed into law. You don't want to miss tonight's show. Now, just a couple of housekeeping matters before we go any further. If you'd like to follow me during the week, you can follow me on IG, that's Instagram, at DZ Cofield. You can follow me on Facebook at DZ Cofield, and you can follow me on Twitter at, you guessed it, DZ Cofield. So there's a lot of bills that are being proposed now, and you're seeing what we're calling white lash happening around our country. You're seeing republicanism taking the shape and form of a religion that, in their view, is replacing the immorality of our society with moral laws and moral acts. And there's no place that this is happening more than in two states. One is Florida and the other is in the state of Texas. And it's almost like the governor of Texas and the governor of Florida are vying to see which one can establish a new right that's even further right than the previous establishment of right. And I'm talking about the right wing, not right versus wrong. I'm happy to have with me a man that I have tremendous respect for and love for, and he has consented to be with us, and that's none other than Dr. Michael Adams. Dr. Adams is a professor of political science at Texas Southern University and is the founding director of the Executive Master of Public Administration program. So for those of you who may be listening and you're interested in getting a Master's of Public Administration, there's an executive program here at Texas Southern University, and Dr. Michael Adams is the founding director of that program. Let's welcome Dr. Michael Adams to Real World, Real Talk. Dr. Adams, what's going on, sir?
Hey, thank you, Dr. Cofield. Glad to be with you.
Man, I appreciate you being with us. I'm really excited to hear your thoughts as a scholar, as a person who is observing this, not just in terms of what's going on today, but through the lens of history and giving us some insight into how history is in a real attempt being put in our path to repeat itself, and what we can do to fight some of the regressive things that are coming about. But first and foremost, let's talk about just in general, as a political scientist, what you're observing, what you're seeing happening in our country and specifically in the state of Texas and other states that are really trying to establish a new far right wing of our country.
Yeah, as a political scientist, I think, first of all, we also have to start with the historical backdrop in terms of where Black people have come from and what this country has presented to us in terms of, some people refer to it as the 1619 Project in terms of the first slaves that came to the United States. However, you have to understand that history to be able to analyze and comprehend what's going on today. And I think what we're seeing is a kind of what we saw at the end of Reconstruction government played out all over again. And we remember in that history, in terms of the Civil War and coming out of the Civil War, we had the passage of the Civil War Amendment, namely the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution. 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment was necessary to bestow citizenship rights upon Black people who had been in this country. And that was a result also of a US Supreme Court case called Dred Scott versus Sanford. And the Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court, a guy by the name of Roger Taney, in his court ruling suggested that Black folks had no rights that white people were deemed to respect, and therefore we were not citizens of these United States. And so the 14th Amendment was necessary. The 15th Amendment was necessary in order to bestow the right to vote upon Black men, because the 19th Amendment later on gave suffrage rights to women. So out of these constitutional provisions, Black people were able to, Black men to participate. They were elected to high office in terms of lieutenant governors. In Mississippi, we had Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce elected to the United States Congress. And Black participation was there during the Reconstruction period. And then we know that there was a presidential election circa 1870s. It was a race between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. And that election was thrown into the Electoral College. And Rutherford B. Hayes wanted to be president so badly that he suggested to the Southern states, if they were to give him their electoral support, he would end Reconstruction government, thereby withdrawing the federal troops from the South. And indeed, that occurred. And as a result of that, we saw the state of Mississippi in 1890 was one of the first states to call a constitutional convention for the express purpose of disenfranchising Black people from voting. And they passed a series of tests, literacy tests, all kinds of tests, grandfather clauses, these kinds of things that would make it difficult and present hurdles for Black people. And what I'm saying, Dr. Cofield, is that if we look at these legislative bodies today, in the Southern states in particular, we see the same type of voter suppression measures being passed and coming out of this, whether it's voter ID, whether it's criminalizing the right to vote, enhancing penalties if you vote illegal from a misdemeanor to a felony. So you can argue that it's a new version of the Reconstruction era of what we saw.
You know, I think what's interesting, Dr. Adams, is one of the things that you talk about is this repeating of the past, as you just referenced, and even more recently, you know, there was so much excitement around Donald Trump's campaign slogan to make America great again. And it was amazing that so many people forgot that same red and white hat that was worn during the Reagan administration to make America great. And the relationship between trying to go back to Nixon and Reagan and Reaganomics and all of those things that we're seeing now, and we're seeing it play out in the House and Senate in the state of Texas. Here's what I want to do for our listening audience. Let me give them a summary of several of the legislative pieces, and I want us to take them one by one to talk about what's important. But before we do that, help our listening audience understand the importance and the role that the Texas House and the Texas Senate play in our day-to-day living, because I don't know if we really realize and recognize how important those positions are.
Yeah, there's a saying that all politics is local. In this sense, if we look at the states, if we take just criminal justice for an example, if anyone were to walk out their door and be accused of a crime, it would be some criminal law that has been enacted by a state legislative body. because the states have what we call police powers, and there are fewer federal laws that you could violate unless you took a gun through an airport. So your day-to-day lives are impacted from the speed limit on the highway going down from Houston to San Antonio, all of these things. And the state budget is so important. If we look at all of the things that matters, whether it's criminal justice, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, these are things that are handed down or implemented by state legislative bodies. And we know that we have healthcare disparities, for example, and we've seen in the state of Texas refused to accept Medicaid funding, for example, to provide healthcare coverage for thousands of poor people. So this is something where we see a government, and there's great irony in it, and I'm going to come back to and make a point about Trump in a minute in terms of the irony, is that if you look at the people who are most in need and the folks that are representing them, they are not passing legislation in their interest, whether it's from an economic standpoint or whether it's from an educational standpoint, in terms of providing sufficient educational funding to make sure that the schools are able to teach and be able to hire faculty and to do these kinds of things. So clearly, I think if you look at
and let me stop you there. Yeah, and let me stop you there, Dr. Adams, because I think it's important for our listening audience to know you're not talking about Black legislators not passing laws to benefit Black people. You're talking about, if I'm not mistaken, white legislators who are not passing laws to benefit their constituency.
Of course. And Donald Trump said in 2016, he likes poorly educated voters. And if you look at that in terms of the fear within the Republican Party, is that Donald Trump has a base that is probably will allow him to win the nomination throughout the primaries, to be on the ballot in the general election again. And this is why, if you look at the party, and there's something that I tell my students, there are various wings in a political party, and it takes two wings to make a party fly, for example. However, we don't see what we used to call within the Republican Party the Rockefeller wing, a more moderating party. George Bush won, for example. These people, although they had some contradictions, but we didn't see the extremism in terms of the rhetoric that we see, that we have seen with Donald Trump on the scene. And he basically, he dog whistles in terms of racism and what have you. And so this has ginned up a base that has become very powerful within the Republican Party, and some of the violence and some of the things that we see. And right now, before Trump, we didn't see all of the expressions of just outright racism that we see today. Implicit bias, we used to talk about that. But clearly, if you look at structural racism, it presents a problem. And we can come back and visit that when we talk about, now that these states are in Republican control and Black people and people of color are in metropolitan areas. So now we see this backlash. Say, you guys are controlling, for example, you have the right to elect people, and you may control the county commission, but we can enact laws to make sure that you're going to have to answer to states, or you're going to have to answer to white supremacy, if you will. Yes.
Yeah, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. D.Z. Cofield, and I have with me as our guest, Dr. Michael Adams, professor at Texas Southern University in the Political Science Department and founding director of the Executive Master of Public Administration program. So, Dr. Adams, I think what is interesting to me is as we're watching this play out, this attempt to go back, and it almost appears like, and I'm echoing your point, that there are some people who are in legislation and in politics who are willing to cut off their own nose to spite their face, right? That even if they know it's not going to benefit the majority of people, for example, the 2.5 million people who are uninsured or underinsured in our state, the majority of them are not people of color, are not Black people. but they're okay with that, and part of that is, again, I think their marketing and their strategy. When you have people who say, I am in support of the Affordable Care Act, but I'm against Obamacare, not understanding that they're one in the same. Let's go down some of these state Senate bills, because everything from state budget to gerrymandering to voting and voter suppression, the state has so much to do with all of that. So let's start with Senate Bill 823. And let me just read a brief summary of that for our listening audience. The employment of the county elections administrator may be suspended with or without pay or terminated at any time for good and sufficient cause on the 4/5 vote of the county election commission and approval of that action by a majority vote of the commissioner's court. Moreover, the Secretary of State can suspend the employment of a county election administrator at any time if an administrative election complaint is filed with the Secretary of State and the Secretary of State believes a recurring pattern of problems with election administration exists in the county. That last one, I mean, it just seems like just as Secretary of State, if they just feel like there's something wrong and they get a couple of complaints, that they can just come in and kind of overturn whatever's happening. Am I misreading that?
No. Well, what has happened, several of the bills are aimed directly at Harris County. And you may recall that Harris County Commissioner's Court, they chose to move away from having the election duties and administration shared between the county clerk office and also the tax commissioner's office, the tax assessor, because in Texas, it goes back to the poll tax where voter registration, you have to pay a poll tax. And so that's why the tax assessor is involved in voter registration. And you had the county clerk that was involved in election administration. And you may remember it was in 2020, we had these long lines at Texas Southern University. Sure. And where there's a gentleman who was there after midnight and he voted and he subsequently indicted by the state, and certainly our attorney general, who has all kinds of problems himself, chose to use this person as an example. And this also is a part of what we saw in the 2020 election, where we saw the big lie put forward by former President Donald Trump. And so what is happening here, you had Senator Betancourt from the Houston area propose this bill basically to get rid of the county election commissioner. And I teach public administration. You would think that if you had an election administrator, someone who was skilled in public administration, this is the person who could give full time to the duties of running the office. And we know in the last election, that was this huge hue and cry about there was not enough paper and these kinds of things. But overall, given a county the size of Houston, Texas, now Harris County, for example, one could say that we had a smoothly run election. And I tell students all the time that in Harris County, we have almost 5 million residents. Compare that with Loving County. In Texas, we have 254 counties. Well, they can do it much better in Loving because they have about 3,000 residents as opposed to 5 million. So I think it's nothing but, again, racial bias. And we see the Republicans here trying to undermine what is happening at the county level and what is happening at the municipal level. If municipalities pass ordinances, or if county enact policies, or if they create changes in the election system, they can go to Austin and they can change it. That's all that is. Right?
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of these are tied to the big lie.
Yes.
Let's go to Senate Bill 1993, and just a summary of this bill. In a county with a population of more than 1 million, the Secretary of State has the power to order a new election if the secretary has good cause to believe that at least 2% of the total number of polling places in the county did not receive supplemental ballots for one or more hours after making a request for them. Now, for those of you who may not know, the 5 most Democratic leaning counties in the state of Texas: Travis County, Austin, 1.1 million people; Bexar County, San Antonio, 1.8 million people; Tarrant County, Fort Worth, 1.8 million people; Dallas County, where Dallas is, 2.4 million; and Harris County, where Houston is, somewhere between 4.2 and 5 million people. I just found this hard to believe. I was looking up the polling places, and I said, okay, let's look at 2% of the polling places. If 2% of them said, hey, we did not receive supplemental ballots for 1 or more hours. So first, Dr. Adams, if you can, explain to our audience what supplemental ballots are.
That means if you go into the polling place, for example, we can also talk about, you can file an affidavit, for example. If you don't have everything, you can cast a ballot. A supplemental ballot means that that's an additional ballot that will allow a person to vote in case if you run out, for example. And again, I'm chuckling because that bill there was aimed at Harris County as well, and also the large metropolitan counties. If you notice, you're the number again, and then I can give you a lesson in Texas legislative politics. It was what, 1 million? You said over 1 million?
Yeah, over 1 million.
They use what they call bracket bills, because you give a population bracket, and in this case, they wanted to target the large urban counties, because in some of the smaller counties, you have 254 counties now. Everything outside of those metropolitan areas probably ruby red in terms of the way they vote. So, well, we don't want to impact our Republican constituents in the smaller counties, so they introduced it and put it in the form of a bracket bill, as opposed to just saying all counties, for example. So again, it was aimed at the large metropolitan counties. You look at DFW, San Antonio, Bexar County, and also Harris County, where Houston is. So Democratic enclaves, for example, but again, you protect your constituents in the smaller counties. That's all that is.
And let me tell you how crazy it is for our listening audience. I was trying to research to find out the number of polling places that we had in Harris County. And so let's just say 300. You know, if there's 300 polling places, that means if 2% of them, or 6 out of 300, say we got our supplemental ballots more than 2 hours late, that they can call for a new election. That to me was like, I just couldn't fathom that you can literally say, okay, no, we got to do that election over.
Right. If I'm correct, there's 1,000 polling places in Harris County. 1,000. Okay. Right. So you can do the percentage there. But again, we saw Mattress Mac here locally, an entrepreneur, furniture salesperson, file suit, and they whipped up because they didn't like the result of the county judge's race, or members in terms of, I think, precinct 4 in terms of Harris County. We saw the incumbent kicked out there. And so to bring this big lie again, and certainly they didn't like the judges, all right? And so let's go back to the images that we see today, and you see these biases, whether it's implicit or whether it's structural racism, for example. Go down to Harris County court, you look at the judges. It's a big difference from the way it used to be, all right? They're women of color, people of color. You have district attorneys, for example, if you look at Dallas, if you look at DA Cruzump, for example, they're going after these people if they are defined as being criminal justice reformists, as opposed to being tough law and order and tough on crime and putting out an issue of public safety. So that's what we see. We see this fight in Austin with the Republican-controlled legislative bodies that are targeting these enclaves. Metropolitan areas, counties, and municipalities are controlled by people of color. Right?
Yeah.
And that's voter suppression, basically. That's what that is.
Well, let's look at one more that's out there that's a another one of the I don't know if this is respectful to say this, the cray Senate bills. So Senate Bill 220, the Secretary of State can take appropriate action to protect the voting rights of Texas citizens from abuse by the authorities administering the state's elections. The Secretary of State can order the administrator to correct the offending conduct, order a temporary restraining order or writ of injunction or mandamus obtained through the Attorney General. The Secretary of State can also appoint a state election marshal who can appoint election marshals statewide, licensed peace officers by the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement, who can be assigned, in quotation marks, to each alleged voting election violation. Essentially, this is an election police force with the legal power to prevent the violation from continuing or occurring. I'm just feeling like this deputized vigilante group, man, coming in, and I may be overstating this, but it just reeks of deputizing KKK members, to be able to go into an area and quote unquote police, which will, in essence, I think in many instances turn into a form of intimidation, depending on where you send these people.
I think you're correct. And it's nothing more than a usurpation of the local administration of elections and also the enforcement of election laws. But we have to go back. And I didn't point out in my historical overview in terms of what has happened. Let's go back to 2013. There's a U.S. Supreme Court case called Shelby versus Holder. And the Holder decision basically gutted the 1965 Voting Rights Act in terms of what we call pre-clearance. None of these things, Dr. Cofield, that we've discussed today in terms of these voting measures would not have cleared the Justice Department prior to 2013. So after the Holder decision, we saw the floodgates open with all of these voter suppression laws, and the state of Texas was one of the first ones to implement voter identification. You are correct, because prior to 2013, we would have had federal deputized marshals in those covered areas of the Voting Rights Act, in particular in the South, in Texas, that would have been there to police and to make sure that there was no voter intimidation and there was unfettered access to citizens who wanted to have a voice and cast a vote, right? So it's nothing more. And then again, if we look at what I call in Texas, we have to have the tripartite control of the Republican Party controlling all three branches of government. We've seen it at the national level. We have a Supreme Court that is not really a Supreme Court that is objective, and the court that we used to see in terms of the Earl Warren Court, for example. This is a court that some people could say that in terms of judicial philosophy is to the right of Attila the Hun, for example.
Yeah.
Very conservative.
Let's talk a little bit after the break about what's happening in the legislature and how it's going to affect education. We've seen people voted off of school boards because they did not take a stand against CRT or critical race theory. There were some people who literally had served on school boards who were great school board members who were concerned about the education of children who didn't even know what critical race theory was.
Of course. Yeah.
And so, my son ran for a HCC seat, and he was asked at one of his appearances, what was his position on critical race theory? Not ever knowing that we would have the legislation on the table that's on the table today that will preclude even the discussion of those subjects on a college campus. So let's take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to Real World, Real Talk on your member-supported public radio station, your number one source for jazz and more, KTSU. Welcome back to Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. DZ Cofield, and you're listening to your member-supported public radio station, your number one source for jazz and more, KTSU 90.9 on the FM dial and KTSUradio.com. Don't forget, even though the spring membership campaign has ended, membership has not ended. Membership is 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days. We need your support to become part of the Choice family. You can go online and find information at KTSUradio.com, or you can text the word member to 713-313-4354. Text the word member to 713-313-4354, and you can become a part of the Choice family. Remember, there is no public radio without the public, and that's you. Let me welcome back the one and only Dr. Michael Williams, who is professor at Texas Southern University and the founding director of the Executive Master of Public Administration program here on our campus. Dr. Adams, let's talk about higher education. You know, I remember when the CRT, or the critical race theory issue, was brought forward. And I remember telling people, you know, I don't know how much effect that's going to have, because, you know, in my entire educational career, and I have a terminal degree, nobody ever talked about critical race theory. I mean, like, that was never, ever presented. Nobody ever talked about it. And then I thought, well, you know, okay, I don't know what harm it's going to do, you know, as long as people can talk about it and engage in these kinds of discussions in colleges, on campuses. But this thing is going to a whole nother level. There's stuff that you've been able to teach, for example, through your career, and subjects that you're not going to be able to talk about anymore, or words that you're not going to be able to use. I was talking to somebody, they were talking about, okay, slavery is banned. Like, you can't use the word slavery anymore, you know, and I'm like, what do you call it? Involuntary servitude. Like, the combination of white fragility, the belief in white supremacy, and the religion of whiteness has created this kind of toxic blend that is working really, really hard to take us back, in some ways, even beyond 1619. I mean, like, it's trying to go back and whitewash everything. Help our listening audience understand what's at stake with these bills and with these laws that are being proposed.
Again, I think it's classic out of the Republican playbook in terms of having state control. And we were discussing earlier in terms of, you mentioned Reagan, for example, all of these things, Reagan, and even both parties, for example, even Bill Clinton, in terms of ending welfare, as we know it, these images of Black people, all right, as being the problem. And also the protection, or in a sense, of what's okay if you go into a corporate setting, the way it's supposed to look, if it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the setting and the undergirding theory that it should be all white, to put it blunt, for example. And these kids, in terms of, you mentioned fragility, they shouldn't be blamed for slavery or racism or these things, as though it's okay to teach history when the majority is about white people, but you can't teach your own history and have that and talk critically in these terms. And critical race theory, we know that there were legal scholars like Derek Bell and others at Harvard University. And Derek Bell talked about the convergence principles in terms of white people only support minority rights only when doing so that it's in their best interest, all right? And so you have critical race theory, they want that banned. They want to do away with diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you look at the population of Texas, for example, and the percentage of Black people, whether it's 12, 10%, 14%, look at the enrollment at Texas A&M. Look at the enrollment at the University of Texas or Texas Tech. It's not going to be commensurate with the population, for example. So we have moved away from these things where a person of color could get into one of these major white universities if they finished at the top of their class, for example. So they're saying that this is discriminating against Asian Americans, for example. It should be based on meritocracy. All right. So where have we come to at this point? If we don't want to compensate for those past wrongs, we don't have to talk about reparations. We just have to deal with equity, for example. We know that it's not equity. So we have all of these things. And even in where I sit my perch as a university professor, they want to do away with tenure because you have these elected, I want to call them politicians, officials, but politicians, if you will, seem to have the viewpoint that nothing really takes place seriously at a university. They're not really teaching anything but trying to encourage the students to be woke, if you will, or to be liberal. So they even want to tap down and do away with tenure. And all of these things, as I mentioned at the top of our discussion here, it comes not only in Texas. There's an organization called ALEC. It's the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's a nonprofit. And what they do, they create these model bills. And what's being introduced in Florida is the same. If you remember now, Florida on yesterday passed what they call the heartbeat bill. Texas did that in 21 in special session. So it's nothing but a way to gin up support and to roll back the time and to actually work against the best interests of the people in need in terms of poor people and people of color.
Yeah. So Texas Education Agency is poised to come in and take over the Houston Independent School District, the largest school district in the state of Texas. I have been an advocate for kids virtually all my adult life, work with at-risk kids. I have come out in support of the TEA takeover. It was not my first preference. My first preference was for the school board to work with and ensure equity in the education of all children. That has not happened historically.
Right.
I submit to people that HISD is systemically still trying not to implement the tone, the tenor, the spirit, or the letter of Brown versus the Board of Education. They've done everything to get around it. They've not been held accountable, even with the best school board members representing African-American people. They are outvoted. And, you know, when you can spend $1 million on a new baseball diamond, you know, for a school and, you know, not give $100,000 for tutoring for a school east of Main Street, it's always a problem. And I argue that HISD historically has been the largest contributor to the school to prison pipeline in the state of Texas. And it's amazing to me how so many people are against the takeover, but they have not been as vehemently against what HISD has done generationally. Give me your perspective. You're looking at this. I will admit I'm a little jaded because I'm in the trenches and I've been down to school board meetings and fought, you know, and let me say this before I go any further, Doc, because somebody said, well, you know, I have an axe to grind because when I had an HISD external charter, they did not extend my contract. This has nothing to do with that. For 7 of the 8 years that I had an external charter, I never received a salary out of 7 of the 8 years. And for me, what was devastating was 5 of the young men who the superintendent at the time said could go back to their home schools, they were not allowed back on their campuses. And we buried 5 of those young men because they had no alternative. And I tell people all the time, in our community, education is not a luxury, it's life or death. And even then, you still might lose your life. But you don't have a chance if you don't have any kind of post-secondary educational experience. I know there are two sides to this. I'd love to hear your opinion and what you're thinking in terms of what's happening and how do we move forward.
I think you're right. There are two vantage points. First, we have to look at the legislation. And there was a bill passed by an African-American, Harold Dutton, for example. He wanted to make sure Felix Wheatley, a school in his district, and you have to give him some credit that it had failed successfully in terms of on the state performance-based tests that were required, and he took a lot of heat for that because it ended up morphing into what we saw the state come in and take over the Houston Independent School District. Another angle would be look at the school boards, look at what we saw. And it seemed as though what was playing out, if we look at the media and we look at the various boards, is that the interest of the students, which should always be the compelling interest in terms of any educational discussion that you're going to have, in terms of whether or not they have the ability to learn and attend school in a safe environment. So some of the things that they were kind of ugly that we saw. And one could surmise that the state was looking at these things, that we have a Texas Education Agency. They've been threatening you, saying that, hey, if you don't get it right, we will come over and take up these duties. I'm reminded by a guy by the name of Ron Walters. You may know him, but he's a late political scientist. Ron started his career at Howard University, ended up at the University of Maryland. He always talked about an accountability theory in terms of politics, for example, and that we have these elected officials, whether they're school board members, whether they're state legislators, we should hold them accountable. And from that accountability, there has to be some type of agenda that we base our determination of what's good for the community and how we would check these things off, as opposed to having politicians who look like us come back every election willy-nilly and asking us to give you your support. And I think we don't see that now. The accountability also extends to the parents, all right? I went to a public school and my mother was involved in the PTA, and I wanted my mother to get involved in the PTA because there was another parent, another student. I felt that the teacher favored him because his parents, they always came to the school. They were always involved in the PTA. And so, you know, I got encouraged. My mom said, well, hey, you got to come to the PTA meetings because something is going on. And I saw that in my experience. And so we have to talk about the community. We know that we have pathologies in the communities where we have the grandparents there with some of the kids. But as a community, how do we use our organizations, whether it's the NAACP or some of these other organizations, to look at the issue as opposed to dealing with things after the fact? For example, I work at a university. One would think that the School of Education, for example, would be involved and with the Houston Independent School District. And we talked about diversity and inclusion. For example, Black people, we are more diverse than anything else. If you just take a look at all the deans at Texas Southern University, and if you look at the things where the involvement of the community and some of the things that you think should occur is not happening because there is no agenda, there's no tie into the Black community. This is a major institution that we have, and everything happening in the community, it should be the focus of the university or embedded in the community. If it's the School of Business, business opportunities, for example. If it's the law school, looking at legal things. If it's the School of Public Affairs, do the things in terms of address the things that we're talking about here. The School of Education, you're there. Health, the same things. Studies in terms of the College of Science and Technology, if you got unhoused people, well, where are the many houses, for example? Where are they being placed? Where are you in these kinds of things? So I think it also comes around, it takes a confluence of the community, the parents, and we have to hold our elected officials accountable to be able to address and to create a better life or even a good life for our people.
So Dr. Adams, let me ask you this, because I had a discussion this past week with a person who was talking about the same thing. And I told him, I said, you know, I've been in ministry over 40 years. I've been in Texas since 1989. I've been in Houston since 1994. And, you know, I have come to the conclusion that there are things going on in our society that are not broke. They're happening as they were intended, right? The miseducation of our children in HISD, the lack of equity, the lack of opportunity is rooted in this false idea of white supremacy, white fragility, and the religion of whiteness that many people practice as opposed to whatever their faith edicts are. My concern is, what do we do when we're in the minority? For example, if there are 9 school board members and we have only 3 votes, right? And you have 6 people that are against you, and you have to convince 2 other people. If you voted as a block, you have to convince 2 other people to go along with you. When there are people who still have the mentality that we are less than human, that we do not have basic inherent human rights, how do we, even if we vote new people in, like, how do we get things done? We're this is not a purple state. This is still a red state, right? How do we make moves? Because I heard one of our state representatives say, at this point, when he goes into session, he's just on the defensive because he knows he doesn't have the vote. And the tragedy is here, we don't have enough money or votes, or at least have not exercised them, I should say, to vote anybody in or to vote anybody out of office. And I'm talking about now those of another cultural persuasion. So, they pay, I think, lip service to some of our historical organizations, but they know that they don't need the Black vote to get elected. And they know that Black people can get mad and protest and march. And at the end of the day, you're going to go home and they're going to do what they want to do. What do you see us being able to do? What is our avenue to be able to facilitate change?
Right. Well, I guess the standard answer is always in terms of compromise or trying to broker a deal or things like that. But I think one of the biggest problems that we have, and I think we have to have an economic foundation in your state to even be effective in politics. And unless we are there in terms of looking at the counties, whether it's the school districts, the school boards, if they're letting contracts, to make sure that the minority businesses are getting a fair share of those. And then we have to control and hold those minority businesses accountable. And I left out the ecumenical institution in terms of the churches and some of these ministries that we see in terms of not giving back, not being community focused, and these kinds of things. So I think if we look at the demographics changes, things are changing in the state of Texas. It's not going to happen now, but we see the Anglos, for example, they are playing chess because they are trying to get ahead of us, for example, and because they see the changes coming in terms of immigration. We saw in the last census, the fastest growing population was Hispanics, those that declare themselves Hispanics, not non-Hispanic whites, for example. It's growing. So I think it will be hard down the road, perhaps not in my lifetime, to prevent minorities from taking control where you'll have governments run by people of color. But at the same time, what does that mean? What does it portend just to have symbolic representation if it does not result in substantive or substantive representation? So that goes back to the agenda. Where is our agenda? What are we for? What are we looking for in education and these kinds of things? What do we want in terms of healthcare? What do these politicians stand? So we have to have an agenda, and we have to work together collectively in terms of that. And we have to understand that we are diverse in terms of our political views. There's Republicans, there are Democrats, but there should be some symmetry as Black folks that we all share, and we can differ on the basis of partisan politics, for example. But there should be some commonality, and there should be some sense given, and the people shouldn't be a token or a face of white suppression. And I'll end by saying, let's reflect on what happened last week in Tennessee. The biggest story to me wasn't necessarily the 2 Black legislators getting kicked out. Why wasn't the white woman not expelled? And I think that's the lesson. That's what we should be analyzing and trying to deal with that and
And
understand
for
where
those
we
people who are
are.
not, for those who are listening who are not familiar with the story, just give us a quick synopsis, Dr.
Yeah,
Adams.
there's a case called the Tennessee Three. We saw in Nashville, Tennessee, there was a shooter that went into a school, for example, and three members of the Texas State Legislature, they went on the floor of the House in Tennessee, and two of them had a bullhorn, but they were three. There were two African American gentlemen and one white woman. However, the members of the legislative body said that they were being disruptive, although they didn't have guns and there was no violence like January the 6th, right? They were expelled and they were voted out of the House of Representatives. However, the white woman, her expulsion fell by one vote or two votes or something. So she was allowed to stay in the legislature. Now, what happened this week, we saw in Nashville and also in Memphis, the two representatives, now they're going back because the metropolitan governing district, see, because Tennessee is a little different from Texas. They have what they call city consolidation. So there's one. There's not a separate city council and a separate county government. It's all in one. So it's called Nashville-Davidson County and also the Shelby County governing body. So they voted to reinstate the two black members.
Yeah. So, Doc, I've got 3 minutes left. With the last 3 minutes or so, tell us some final thoughts as we see the Texas legislature, doing what it's doing, and what are you suggesting that people do, not just to stay aware, I should say, but to also stay active or to get active in this process?
Yeah, I think it's very important. Public education, to me, should be ranked at the top of the public policy issues that the legislature should be addressing. They're not doing that. They're going back and forth in terms of how the funding would be counted, whether it's based on enrollment or attendance in terms of schools. Also, voter suppression is very important in terms of looking at the challenges and looking at the face of Black people, how we confront the election process, whether it's voter registration, deterrence, whether it's election results being challenged. And also, you mentioned the criminal justice system, the school to prison pipeline. We need to stop that. We can't have a small community, for example, having 300 Black people living there, but 1,000 Black people in jail. It's something wrong with that picture, and it's not a good picture. So we have a lot of challenges. I think collectively we have to struggle. And as James Baldwin used to say, is that we can overcome these things, but it would take a great deal of pain and in some instance, terror, if you will. So I think we have a history of being able to be here, and we're still here, for example, and certainly the struggle continues.
Dr. Adams, thank you so much for being with us tonight on Real World, Real Talk. Appreciate you, sir.
Thank you. I enjoyed it, Doc. All right. Take care.
The late Vernon John said, if you see a good fight, get in it. I always add, if you don't see a good fight, start one. And the fight for our community is a fight that you want to get involved in. One of the things that we're going to be challenged to do is take responsibility for our education, the education of our own children and in our own history. And I know this is a separate argument, but let me say this. When will we get tired of begging somebody else to educate us properly? There are tools, there are vehicles, there are conduits through which we can educate our own children. Charters are one way. That's public education. People are on both sides of the fence regarding the voucher system. Just because you're a poor parent doesn't mean you shouldn't have a choice, and you should not be able to put your child in a loving environment instead of just having your child have to go to a neighborhood school that may be a failing school. We've got to do better. We just have to do better. And at the end of the day, with all of the hoopla and all of the histrionics and all of the protests, At the end of the day, this has got to be about our kids. It's not about adults. And we cannot afford to see another generation miseducated, undereducated, and virtually unemployable when they walk across the graduation stage. If they get across that stage, we've got to do better as adults by those who are coming behind us. I'm Dr. D.Z. Cofield for Real World, Real Talk. Stay tuned for Truth, V. Michael McKay, David Goldstein, Asia, and their guests as they come up right after our show. Until next time, God bless is my prayer.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Real World, Real Talk. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast to be notified of new episodes every week. Follow us via social media using the @RWRTDZ username on all platforms: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To submit any comments, questions, sponsor opportunities, or future show suggestions, visit us online at rwrtdz.com or via email at info@rwrtdz.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you've been inspired to be the change you want to see in the world today. Until next time, be real, keep it real, and stay real.